So one has to be, I think, vigilant, be aware of these kinds of phony scientific papers, phony discourse, phony jargon that's invented. You know, when corporations, who are corporations? I mean, we live in a capitalist economic system. What are they dedicated to? To preserving the environment or to making money? Their alpha omega is about making money. And I think when we're talking about this system, we should name it, first of all. And I don't use the euphemism free market. You know, another thing that Orwell warned good writers not to do. Don't use euphemisms when you can actually name the thing. Like US foreign policy, imperialism, aggression, war, attack, bombings. That is much closer to what US foreign policy, which is kind of an antiseptic term. Well, US foreign policy, Bangladeshi foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, Ivory Coastal foreign policy, etc. Again, you know, going back to Orwell, he wrote a very influential essay called Politics in the English Language. And I recommend that you all read it. Anyone who wants to be a writer, but also anyone who wants to decode the propaganda. This is a very good essay to read. And he writes here, this is, by the way, over 60 years ago, in our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Political language has to consist largely of euphemisms, question begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia. Canada is a small wannabe power. The US is the major, global imperial power. I could say that. I will say it. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out, the cattle machine gun, the huts set on fire, and this is called pacification. And you might recall during the Vietnam War, the US had a program of pacification, and it was literally mass murder from the sky, where entire tracts of Indochina, that is to say Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, became free fire zones. They were carpet bombed. I often say I live in the USA, the United States of amnesia, because there's no memory of anything. We have a media that's fawning, that's obsequious, that the journalists are largely lapdogs with laptops. They're stenographers to power, and they are, as was mentioned in the introduction, a weapon of mass distraction. So this year in US history is a very significant year. Why? Not because Whitney Houston died, because 50 years ago, John F. Kennedy, who's revered as a god in the United States, for various reasons, 50 years ago, Kennedy launched the first air raids on Vietnam. That was 50 years ago, in fact, February, almost 50 years exactly. And this, of course, was the first major US military escalation in Vietnam. It was to lead to the deaths of 58,000 Americans, which we all regret. But never mentioned is the 3 to 4 million Indochinese who perished in that war to keep the world safe for democracy. Your prime minister at the time was Lester B. Pearson. Every time you fly into Toronto, you may see his name. I think it's at the airport there. Lester B. Pearson was a very passionate advocate of the US war in Indochina, and Canada played a major role in supplying material to the US. Chomsky, when he used to come to Canada in the 70s, used to point this out, and people were very upset with him that he, kind of blew the whistle on Lester B. Pearson. Orwell also warned against the use of the passive voice. So as I just named John Kennedy as the person who launched those attacks, rather than attacks were launched, the US Air Force bombed. Using the passive voice is a way of eliminating, of course, identification and agency. So things happen, you know, snow falls, a village burns to the ground, a building collapses, a nation is attacked. Condoleezza Rice, who in my view is a major war criminal by the standards of Nuremberg and should be, you know, sitting in The Hague with Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and all the others. It's interesting that in Calgary last night, my very same sentence got also applause. It's unintended. I'm angry that these people are walking around. That these people who, by any objective standards of international law and human morality, you know, are major war criminals. And if you remember, if you go back to Nuremberg, and it's always interesting to look at Nuremberg because it is partly victor's justice. We're right nearby here, Winston Churchill Street, I believe. So Winston Churchill Square, you know, the bomber of Dresden, a city that he knew had no military value, you know, incinerating tens of thousands of people long after the war was, the war was already over basically. And you can actually read about this in Slaughterhouse 5, which I'll come to a little bit later, a book that is banned and challenged in many jurisdictions in the US, believe it or not. Not for its depictions of mass murder from the sky by the British 8th Air Force, I believe it was, but for what? It promotes drinking. I know I'm in Canada, so nobody's involved with that. Cursing and sex. These, you know, three things that I'm sure Canadians are totally unfamiliar with. It's kind of rampant in the U.S., so I think that's why, you know, we need to be protected from books like Slaughterhouse 5, and of course its content. So a couple of days ago, excuse me, in the Financial Times, I remember when Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, was visiting London, the banner headline said, in Iraq, mistakes were made. Whoa, mistakes were made. Okay, who made those mistakes? Who is going to be held accountable? The US attack on Iraq, no matter whatever you may think about Afghanistan, is such an unambiguous war crime that any first-year law student at the University of Calgary or here at the University of Edmonton Alberta, sorry, University of Alberta in Edmonton. Any first-year law student could win that case. It's a slam dunk. I mean, you wouldn't have to do any research. The planning and waging of aggressive war is the supreme international war crime. That's why the Germans were held to account for invading Norway, for invading France, for invading Greece, for invading Yugoslavia. The planning and waging of aggressive war. Not only that, the threat of war is a war crime under Nuremberg, and it is part of the UN Charter. So the saber-rattling that Israel is conducting right now in Ottawa and elsewhere with Stephen Harper, right next to Netanyahu, and also Obama and Panetta and the other, you know, the war party in the United States, that too is a war crime, threatening Iran with violence. Even sanctions is considered a hostile act of aggression. Under US generals have said that. US military has said that if anyone imposes sanctions on the empire, because when you're the empire, you have total immunity. You can commit as many crimes as you want. But if somebody, you know, walks out of a Domino's or a Pizza Hut without paying for a slice of pizza, they're going to jail. But if you invade a country, no problem. You know? Hasta luego.